field that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome.
So she builds planets on Earth, you guys.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very special release event for the Ladies' Handbook for her mysterious illness. I'm James Monroe. I'm the producer of adult programs at the Museum of Science, Boston, and I am so excited to be here tonight to introduce our very special guests. We are joined by the author of this important memoir, Sarah Ramey, who is here tonight celebrating the paperback release of the book, and she is joined in conversation with advice columnist and features writer from the Boston Globe, Meredith Goldstein, and together they have such an insightful conversation in store for all of us. They're going to dig deep into some of the experiences that Sarah so bravely shared in this important read. And tonight is a part of our current winter-spring virtual season of adult programming, which is already coming to an end. After tonight, we have one event left. We'll be back tomorrow night, Thursday, May 20th, for an event called From the Mic to the Glass. We'll be joined by musician Ruby Rose Fox and sommelier Manny Gonzalez. It's going to be a great one. So I encourage you to go to our website at mos.org/adults. You can check out all those details and register for your spot and come and wrap up an incredible virtual season with us. And while you're at our website, you can register for our adult programs email list, which is the best way to stay up to date on everything happening here at the museum for adults, including the announcement of our upcoming fall season, which will be coming this summer. Now, a little bit later on, Meredith and Sarah will be taking some of your questions. So as those come to mind, you can submit them at any point tonight by going to slido.com and entering the code Sarah Ramey, all one word. Once again, that's Slido, SLIDO.com, with the code Sarah Ramey, all one word. I need to thank our friends from the Lowell Institute for their continued support of the adult programming here at the museum. Without them, we would not be here tonight, and this event would not be free for all of you. So please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause and thanks to the Lowell Institute. And finally, after the conversation tonight, I ask all of you to go to donate.mos.org/mosathome and consider making a gift to allow us to keep bringing free virtual content just like tonight into all of your homes. Once again, that's donate.mos.org/MOS at home. But now it's my extreme honor and pleasure to welcome to the stream our guest tonight, author of the Ladies' Handbook for her mysterious illness, Sarah Ramey, in conversation with Meredith Goldstein.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. It's so lovely to be here, and by here I mean safely at home, but looking forward to a more outside world. And I'm delighted to be here with Sarah tonight. I just want to introduce Sarah officially. She's a writer and musician who received her MFA in creative nonfiction writing from Columbia. She worked on President Obama's 2008 campaign and was a recipient of the 2018 Whitting, am I saying that correctly, Creative Nonfiction Grant, and she lives in Washington, D.C. She also wrote a book that made me laugh, cry, and clutch it to my heart, and I'm so excited to talk to her about this tonight. I really want to reiterate that if you have questions at any point during this presentation, absolutely put them in at the link, and we will get to them. Sarah, welcome. Welcome to the Museum of Science in spirit and philosophically. I wanted to start for those who've come here without knowing much. This book is a memoir, a guide, a mystery, therapy, so many different things. And, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about the book, what it is to you and where it began?
Okay, so thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. I want to thank the Boston Museum of Science and you for doing this. This is so exciting for me. So a little bit about the book. If you have not read it or you have no idea what we talk about when we talk about the mystery illnesses, the book is really about three things. Number one, it's about my story and my own sort of tumble down the rabbit hole of having an illness that no one can diagnose and nobody can figure out what's going on, and it's not treated particularly well. But then at a second level, it's about realizing that this was not just my personal story and my personal nightmare, that there were so many people like me that had these, quote, mystery illnesses. And they're only called mystery illnesses because it's so common to go for so long without a name, without a diagnosis. But if you have one of these, you usually end up somewhere along the way with a diagnosis like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, many different autoimmune diseases, mast cell activation, dysautonomia, POTS, Ehlers-Danlos. There's a whole family, Lyme, post-Lyme, et cetera. And these illnesses really have three things in common. The symptoms are very similar. They are treated very poorly by traditional medicine. They're often treated as if they're all in your mind. And they predominantly affect women, really disproportionate, 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. And that last bit is really a clue as to why they're treated so poorly. And then the third thing the book is about is just medicine as a whole and how it could miss millions of us and what the blind spots are in medicine right now. So that's kind of what the book is about. And then to answer your question, where it began was, so I'm 40, this is like the first times I've been saying this out loud, but I'm 40, and this started when I was 22. I was a senior in college. It was a long time ago. It was 18 years ago. And I was starting my senior year of college, and I was very active. I was the director of the school musical and the head of the a cappella group and the singer in a band and a writer for the school paper. I mean, really, really, really active. But I had a UTI, a urinary tract infection, which I had never had one before. And, if that's all you've ever had, that does kind of feel like the end of the world. They're quite painful. But knowing what would come afterwards, I would readily trade in the old UTI for what came later. But so I had this UTI, and I'm going through my senior year, and I went home for Christmas break. And it had gotten to the point where I really needed to seek better help. And so I went to see, my parents are both doctors. And so they said, well, you should go see our colleague, this excellent doctor in Washington, D.C., and he'll sort you out. And so I did. And he said, oh, I see what's going on here. He said, you don't have a UTI actually today. He's like, your tests are negative. You have urethral spasm. So we're going to perform this procedure on you. Very simple, just a little dilation. We're going to stretch or rip the urethra and you'll be fine after that. And so I thought, well, that doesn't sound great, but you're the expert. I'm happy to do whatever it takes. And he's like, it's not that bad. It's not very painful. No problem. So I saddle up. The procedure begins, and instead of being not very painful, it is, the most painful. It's like being hit by lightning in your urethra, something nobody wants. And it was horrific. But he finishes the procedure, and the attitude between me and the doctor was, he was acting as if I just needed to put my big girl panties on, and that I just needed to toughen up, just suck it up, and you'll be fine. And the pain that you've been experiencing will go away. So I agreed. I was like, okay, I'm going to put on my biggest big girl panties and go home, and I'll be fine. Within about 12 hours, I woke up at about 4 or 5 in the morning. I had a sky-high fever. My muscles were burning. I was covered in sweat. My muscles were clenching and unclenching. Something was clearly very wrong. I go down to my mom's room. My mom is a doctor, and she immediately realizes that I've probably become septic, which is an infection of the bloodstream. So she drags me by the scruff of my neck to the emergency room, where I'm immediately admitted. I am septic, and I'm admitted for the next 4 days. So I go from being very healthy, everything is fine except for this UTI, to having this procedure that the doctor says is totally normal, everything is fine, to becoming septic and then hospitalized. And nobody understands why this is happening. And so, some tests are run. I'm put on a lot of antibiotics for the infection, and kept in the hospital for the rest of the week. But when we couldn't figure out what had caused any of this, my doctor said, well, we don't really know what's going on here, but surely if you're just going to bounce back, you're going to get better. And then you're young, you're healthy otherwise, and everything is going to be fine. And so that was what I assumed as well. And so I went back to school and I did not get better and better. I was sleeping constantly. My muscles ached from tip to toe. I felt like I had the flu permanently. So that was sort of on one track, these sort of global symptoms of fatigue, extreme brain fog, muscle aching, flu-like symptoms. On another track, I had extremely severe pelvic pain, vaginal pain on the left side, as well as my colon stopped working. And I had to take a ton of laxative. So I have this huge problem where I am sleeping constantly. I feel sick constantly. I am in excruciating pain. I can no longer wear pants. I am barely getting to my classes. I am barely able to graduate. And nobody has any idea what's wrong. And so everybody else goes away to spring break, and then I go home to see, 10 doctors and travel to New York to see a specialist. And I see doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor. And in the beginning, and this is very common, this is basically the always the way that it goes, is that the doctors look and look and look for what could be causing this. But as the tests come back negative, a new understanding starts to arise. And that's, I know what's happening here. This is an unhappy young woman badly in need of an antidepressant. And that happened to me at a urologist. He had just done an excruciating exam. And I will never forget this. After he does this very painful exam that caused me to pass out, he was very annoyed that I had passed out. And my parents were with me. And so he called them in to discuss his findings. And he says, well, all of her tests are perfectly normal. There's nothing wrong at all with her urethra. There's no congenital issues, nothing wrong at all. He said, and he's looking at them. And he's like, and I'm sitting right here. And he's looking straight at them. He says, what I think you need to consider is Sarah, like so many young women her age, has a psychological problem. And I'm just sitting right there. I'm 22 years old. And I just remember feeling so crushed, but also like, well, maybe this guy is just mean. But that is not what happened. What happened is doctor after doctor after doctor that I went to after that, they all came to that same conclusion, which is if you don't have something that shows up on the available testing that I have available to me, then it must be that you are hysterical, malingering, lying, exaggerating, some version of some terrible, terrible thing to hear about yourself from people that you trust. And so that's basically, that's how it began. And a very long and short of the rest of the next 18 years is I still have all of those problems. There have been times where it was much, much worse, and I was severely bedridden, had to be taken care of by my mom, who's in a wheelchair sometimes. And then there are times like now where I'm able to do, like one event like this per day, but like this is the maximum plus going to the pharmacy or something. And I have very, very severe pain still from that original injury. It's called complex regional pain syndrome. It's the most painful pain syndrome that exists. And I ended up having to get an ileostomy bag, which is like a colostomy bag, because my colon has no function anymore. And so those are sort of like the big things. I'm diagnosed with CRPS, ME, CFS, and then I also have this ileostomy bag. Those are sort of like the three big things, even though there's a lot of other stuff going on. So that's kind of the way that it began and kind of what's going on for me now, which I said this to you before, it feels important to me usually to say that, because sometimes I'll get all the way to the end of the talk and people in the audience are like, I'm so glad you're cured and you're better, because look at you now, you don't look sick, which is really one of the refrains that you hear if you've got one of these invisible illnesses.
Well, it's beautifully said. And I want to disclose that when the museum asked me to moderate tonight, I think they did so because I love good writing and I love memoirs by women. And I love people who exhibit empathy. So all of that was right. But I also happen to have a sister with a mysterious illness. And one of the things that I was so greatly grateful for in this book was that you sort of rank the sort of status that you can have when you are a woman. And yes, it is a very gendered issue, right? That this can, we all have, I think, friends in our lives who say, well, I have this thing and I think it's this, but I don't quite know, but it doesn't really affect me unless I don't have sleep. And then you sort of bring it up to a level where it really interrupts your life. Can you talk about who you saw over the years? And, I think as soon as you see this in the world, you begin to find other people where you say, oh yes, I'm not the only one, where you sort of found your own system of, oh, here are the levels to which people can be affected by these illnesses we cannot name.
Yeah. So in the beginning, for the first 2 years, I really thought that I was the only person that this had ever happened to and would ever happen to. Like it was just a completely singular freak event that was happening to me. And then I was introduced to, I had a boyfriend at the time who was talking to a coworker of his, I'm sure about like his sick girlfriend, and his coworker was like, "Oh, that sounds just like my wife." And so they introduced the two of us because they thought we would have a lot in common. And she starts telling me her story, and my jaw was on the ground. I just could not believe that I had found the one other person on planet Earth who had the exact same thing as me, or very similar. And she sort of gave me some books to read, and that was sort of like the beginning of like I described the book like a tear in reality, like where I was like, I don't think that the way I'm thinking about things is right. and so not that long after that, I was introduced to somebody else. She tells me her story. I was like, man, this is exactly like my story as well. Who can imagine meeting this many people that have my one crazy disease? And then I slowly started to meet more and more people. And then when I realized that it was a phenomenon that was not at all unique to me, that affected millions and millions of mostly women, I started to write about it. And writing about it and kind of telling people that I was writing about it, that like sent the sort of bat signal into the sky. And like people like me, I call us WOMIs, a woman with a mysterious illness, because there is no umbrella term for this type of neuroendocrine immune problem, even though they are so often comorbid with each other. It's so common to have, many of these diseases at the same time, or to have one diagnosis and then it changes to a different diagnosis. It's clearly a family that kind of all travels together. So you would think there would be a parent name, but there isn't. And so that I don't have to say over and over again, like people like me, or MECFS and MCAS and POTS and all these different acronyms. I just call us all WOMIs or MOMIs, or a person with a mysterious illness, a POMI. And that, as soon as I announced that I was writing about it, like WOMIs just came like hurtling out of the trees. And I was surprised. I was like, this is an important thing that is happening all around us, but I was not prepared for the number of people that would come out of the woodwork, including people that I knew and had no idea that they were struggling with any type of health problem. And so I started to collect all these stories. I started to read an incredible amount, to read as many books as I could. In the beginning, there were a lot of like alternative health books, but then I got, really deep into, the quote regular science and the New England Journal of Medicine, what it had to say on the same topics, but in a different tone. And the more that I did that, the more it became clear what you were referencing, which is that this is not a static problem. We just have this illness, and these are the symptoms, and this is how it always presents. And this is like the one level of severity, that there's actually this enormous continuum that I would call it of, I say it's like a WOMI 1 to a WOMI 5. I think you could really break that out into like a WOMI 1 to a WOMI 100. But just to give a basic idea of, WOMI 1s they don't consider themselves sick. They just have some symptoms that bother them, but it's fine. And you get up to like a WOMI 3, this person is florid with symptoms and does know that they're sick, but is perfectly able to keep working, for example. Then you get to like a WOMI 4, where this person cannot function anymore in, and has to stop basically participating in their own life and just exist in sort of a homebound existence. I'm now in the WOMI 4 zone. And then the WOMI 5 zone is you can't do anything. You cannot work from home. You cannot see your own friends. You cannot make your own food. You cannot shower. It is just a nightmare. And I would say WOMI 5s, there's a spectrum there as well that, because I have been in that place, but I know people who are even sicker than I was. But that's very important, and that's not dissimilar from lots of illnesses that have stages, right? And this is normal. But a lot of what the work of the book is sort of like making a map of this thing that was unmapped, where it just felt like all white noise. And the whole project was to try and make the magic eye picture pop out so that you could actually see, well, what is actually going on here. But it's very difficult because it really does just feel pixelated. Like you cannot make heads or tails of what's going on, because it shouldn't be on the shoulders of the patient to figure something like that out.
We already have a question about why are more women affected than men, and we have to get to that, right? Because this is, as my sister and I went to, as she began to seek treatment for herself for what we call Crohn's disease, but it also could go by 17,000 of the names, leaky gut, the things you mentioned in your book, these diagnoses that are sort of vaguely autoimmune and many other things. She would meet people, I would meet people who would say, oh, me too, that's me too. And they were all women.
Yes.
So I have some theories. I've read many of yours, but let's talk about how this happened and how you are mapping a thing that has previously not been mapped. And the question is why?
Yeah, well, to me, it's interesting because when I first set out to do this, I was like, this is a women's issue. And the reason that this is happening is because it's a women's issue. And that's if you inverted the ratios, if this was, 8 out of 10 fibromyalgia patients were men, we would instantly be like funding it to the gills to figure out, like, what is this horrible, excruciatingly painful scourge on the modern male workforce, right? But when it's women, it's like, well, have you considered, maybe that this isn't happening at all? That's extremely, extremely common. And that tracks with just the history of women in medicine, of the way that women have been treated in medicine. It's not like this is a new phenomenon. I just read a really good book that's coming out in June called Unwell Women, which is a history of the way women have been treated in medicine. And it's just horrible. I knew all of it, but to see it all sort of collated in one place was very helpful as like a real history of like, if you want to understand why we are ignoring, these millions of women who have a disease that, because the predominant symptoms are pain and fatigue, which are both invisible, that's really the problem. I think if you had like some big obvious thing that was visible, I don't think that it would be more difficult to be as sexist about it. But because it's invisible, and this happens all the time with marginalized communities, it's like, well, if you can't see it, then maybe it isn't happening, and which of course is not true. But I think that has a lot to do with what's going on here. One thing I did want to say is that it's very common for people to say to me that, well, what about the male patients? Like, are you just going to ignore the male patients? And my response, well, two things. My first response is, well, of course not. I mean, they're just as important and just as valid. But if you're a male patient that has one of these problems, you should definitely consider that you're being treated this way by your physicians because you have a woman's problem. And it should make you more alive to what happens if you happen to be in any way marginalized, in this case being a woman. But another thing people say, which is pretty common, is, well, don't you think that it's actually just that men don't complain about their problems as much? And that's why we don't know if this is, that's why we don't hear from as many men about this. This is what I call an old husband's tale. This is not true. This is I think most of us who know the men in our lives, they are very vocal when they do have a problem. A lot of them. There is sort of like an old school type of man, maybe, that's like very stern and gruff and doesn't talk about his problems. But for the most part, all my male friends, they are the squeakiest wheels. And especially in the groups that I'm in, chronic illness groups, it'll be, 8 to 2, female to male in the group. But the men speak as much as all of the women do. It's about 50-50 in terms of like whose voices are part of the mix. Like men are very, very vocal about these problems. So I think that this is a sort of a mythos that we've passed on that supposes that men are just incredibly stoic and don't speak up when they have a problem. And that I have just found that to not be true. And the reason it kind of bothers me, or it doesn't kind of bother me, it really bothers me, is that supposes that, especially let's say you're a WOMI 5 or a WOMI 4, that you could just muscle through it. If you were just stoic enough, you could keep it invisible and nobody would ever be the wiser. This is absolute nonsense. Like, that's not true at all. And all the men that I know that are in that 5 place, like there is no way to muscle your way out of it. And so it's so disrespectful to the people who, especially women who are sick with these problems, to say like, well, don't you think that it's just, we only hear about it from women because they complain so much. It's like,
well, I was going to say, if anything, I think my experience figuring out who these women are in my life, the stoicism is there, right?
Yes.
Where like they've been saying, you know what, I'm not going to make this a problem for anybody else. I'll talk to my doctor about it, but I'm going to make my life work around it. And maybe they're at a 2 or at a 3, but they are, I mean, I watched my sister do this for years. I'm making it happen. I'm not going to let this get in my way. And
ding, ding, ding.
of course that it's like, and I'm a caretaker to others, and I'm a, so I want to talk a little bit about, we'll get to more about this soon, about who this book is for, because it's for many people. I found myself feeling a little bit guilty as a family member. I so desperately want my person to feel better that I'm looking for the one thing, like,
Yeah.
and I think that this idea that doctors were looking for this, these are your emotions. If you could be less depressed, everything would go away. I think to my sister, it was, if you lost weight, this is, right. and then when she would and nothing would change, then, but I am guilty of course, seeing a commercial for a biologic, or, what if there's a magic drug? What if there's a magic lifestyle, a magic city? The geography will fix what would you say to people who have somebody like this in their life, where your instinct, I think, as someone who loves them, is to troubleshoot in the most reductive way? But if we only found the one thing, and I think, when you and I talked about this before the event, we talked about meditation. If you just meditate, it'll all, does that magic cure, has it ever existed? And what do you tell people about being helpful and fighting that instinct of let's try this one thing?
Right. Well, this is if there was a magic cure, we'd be taking it. I mean, that's all of us who have these like very elaborate, Frankenstein self-care and medication and supplement routines that we're on to just try to maintain the amount of health we've been able to protect. All of us would much prefer to just be on a medication that made it all go away, or that did that for us, right? And not do any of these other things. So here's what I would say. So the suggesters, the people that are coming from a good place, they really want to help you. When you're the suggestee, it is very upsetting, not because somebody is giving you a suggestion. Like, somebody gives you a suggestion, fine. It's because you're constantly fielding that from every direction, from friends, family members, people you don't know, people in my direct messages online, just loads of people who are kind of doing like a drive-by suggesting, where they just sort of like dump a suggestion in your lap and then they take off and they leave. And the problem is that it kind of damages your relationship with that person, because now what you really need is support from that person. Like you need like, and I'm not talking about you and your sister. I think this is very different from you and your sister, but like most people who maybe are having trouble getting the support that they need from their friends or family members, and all they're getting is suggestions from them instead of like bringing by some chicken soup, or instead of like picking up the kids after school, or instead of like doing something to actually help them, they're being like, have you tried celery juice? Or, you know, my mom tried this supplement. Have you tried that? That feels so painful, because then if you don't do that thing, then it's hard to go back to that person and kind of lean on them just for emotional support, because you're afraid that they're going to be like, yeah, but did you try the celery juice? And they're not taking into account that like, that will be the 1001st thing that you have tried to make yourself better. And that there are 25 other things in the wings that you are waiting to try and experiment on your human body with. And that it's all, every single thing that you experiment with has the potential to go very wrong. That's very common that you try, you know, eating a bucket of ground snails. Like that's the example I always use. Is like, that's a made up thing, but like I would do that if somebody was like, we have clear evidence that all you need to do is eat a bucket of ground snails for the rest of your life. I'd be like, well, then that's what I need to do to not feel this way. But so many of us are trying so many things like that, or trying all kinds of different medications that have so many side effects that are so devastating. And each one, I mean, is months of sort of like dealing with like, is this helping? Is this not? Is it causing problems? And it's so much of your life to devote to something like, you know, that probably is not going to help you at all. And you've tried 1,000 of those things. And so when somebody comes to you with another one and not offering to help you pay for it or help you do it or anything, that's what I mean about it feels like this drive-by suggestion, where it's like, to them, it's nothing. They just get to drop it off in your lap. But to you, it makes you feel really inadequate that you haven't tried every last thing. And again, like it makes it much harder to go back to your community for what you actually need, which is emotional support, which is the support that we give to our friends who have cancer, for example. Like we don't like, or some people do this, but most people do not get into those people's DMs and be like, here's what you actually, well, this does happen, but I think not to the degree that it does with Lomies. People show up and they help. They do things to actually help and support that person. And I've seen this in my own life, you know, patients who have cancer versus patients who have ME/CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. I mean, it is truly night and day. And so that's kind of what I mean. Now, the last thing about that is, because the suggestions are coming from a good place, and we don't want to cut off suggestions completely, because what if somebody does have a helpful idea? This is what I always say is, number one, you need to self-screen. You need to really think about perhaps not suggesting it. Like, have I really looked into it? Do I know that this has like a high likelihood of helping this person first? And then second, if you are going to do it, to go to that person like crawling on your belly and say, I suck. I'm sorry, I'm going to dump another suggestion on you, but I did read about this thing. It reminds me so much of you. Here's the reasons that I think it's such a good option for you. And I would be so happy to help you in any way, to either pay for it or do a GoFundMe to raise the money for it. Or if it's a dietary thing, to like help you make some of the meals, so that, again, you're not just like putting it all on that person. I think that when you offer things in that way, it's a lot easier for the person to take and not feel like crushed yet again by the suggester.
I have a zillion questions, and we're getting some great questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to everything. But I want to talk about the pandemic, because obviously, you know, this is about, I think many of us learned that our friends had comorbidities during this process, right? And it suddenly became this interesting thing to talk about. I remember a friend calling me when the vaccines were announced, and she was like, well, I have 2, and here's what they are, and you only have 1, so you have to wait. And it was actually quite delightful for me, coming from a family with a lot of illnesses, that all of a sudden we were all disclosing what we had, how it affected us, you know, what were our concerns, what were our, you know, our feelings of elation about the vaccine, how would it affect us? we're having this event online tonight because there's a global pandemic. So when you look at the last year, there were some disheartening things talking about people with pre-existing conditions as if they were disposable. But then they were a closer look at how bodies are actually faring on any given day, that we suddenly had to pay attention. Who is high risk? Who's not high risk? How do we need to protect them? Did you notice a better awareness of people not just being all healthy or not healthy, or am I projecting that all over onto that question?
I think, yes, I think so in sort of a very broad sense in terms of just basic chronic illness and I think like less severe chronic illness, like so the problems that you can hide, right? I think that there's a lot more understanding and awareness and bringing to the surface lots of the things that you mentioned, and that's good, because even when you're in the WOMI 2 or early WOMI 3 area, you still need support. I mean, it sucks to be so symptomatic all the time and not have any support around that whatsoever. So I think that is very, very positive. Sort of on the less positive side, there was a lot of, I thought that there would be a lot more people coming to me or to people like me saying, gosh, all that you've been saying all those years about being homebound and how horrifying that is, to be so cut off from everybody, to be so isolated, to have your job be in such peril because of this thing that's completely out of your control, to be kind of like haunted by illness at all times. I really thought, because there's so many parallels between just being a WOMI, especially if you're homebound and really cut off from other people, and what we've all just been through in the last year. I kind of thought that there would be more connection made between people and my people, but that I haven't seen that very much. I mentioned this to you already. What I got instead was a lot of requests to write articles to help people deal with coronavirus, because I had so much experience with like dealing with being isolated, dealing with being alone. I just responded to all those requests and was like, no, I would like to see articles by all these people about how they're going to help people like me after coronavirus, when they go back to living a healthy life, but now understand how horrifying it is to be trapped in your home all the time. Like, what kind of support are they going to offer in an ongoing way to people with disabilities or people who are chronically ill and homebound and things like that? So it was, I would say it was a mixed bag from my perspective.
I want to talk about sort of alternative medicines, Eastern medicine. You're very candid in the book about, just like any kind of medicine where there are ups and downs. And I think we're at a place in the world where we're critiquing this concept of wellness, right? And I think it appeals to so many women because the women are not heard in the doctor's office in any way. So, but it's also yet another system to navigate. What is expensive isn't always helpful. What is new isn't always perfect. How you write about this, but how much did you want to weave in these different sides of treatment into your critique of the system?
Yeah, well, so when you're a WOMI or a MOMI or a POMI, basically everyone had, the structure of everyone's journey is almost identical. You try to get help from traditional medicine because it's like for most of us, that's like the system that we are used to, that we trust the most, et cetera. But when there is no help for you at all, not a single treatment for you, and you're being treated abusively by doctors, by being told that you're hysterical, it is not just understandable, it is rational to seek an alternative type of treatment. But the problem is that then you're just sort of set loose into like the wilds of alternative medicine, which is not a singular discipline that's like, okay, welcome to alternative medicine. Like on, the first floor, we've got blah, 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 like there's no plan for you if you defect from regular medicine. And so instead you're just sort of like wandering in the wilderness, trying usually just like kind of what you might have read about before, or what you read an article about, or what a friend tried, or it's very haphazard. And that is not a great way. Self-navigating in alternative medicine is not a very effective way of finding treatment. Now, some people do, they hit on the thing that helps them: acupuncture, changing their diet, fixing their gut, whatever it is. And then what happens is that those people then become proselytizers for that thing, for that one thing that helped them. And they become like, yeah, proselytizers that are out, that are like, you know, Bible thumpers that are like out to, you know, convert as many people as they can to the wonders of whatever the thing is that helped them. And the problem with that kind of thinking is it's very similar to kind of miracle pill thinking in Western medicine, which is like, you just need to take this one thing and then that solves all your problems, you know. And that is especially for these super complex illnesses, which these illnesses are pretty complex, especially because we just don't understand them at all. It just doesn't work. And what you really need is kind of to zoom the camera out a little bit and kind of look at, okay, well, what treatments are working for different people, for different conditions? Why does, for example, like psychedelics, why do psychedelics help some people with the same problem that somebody else, something like meditation or yoga, seem to help them with the same problem? Instead of, what's often happens is people are like, instead of trying to see what those things have in common, what they may be doing to, you know, the effect it may be having on the brain that's similar, instead people are like, oh, well, yoga and meditation, that's real, but, you know, ayahuasca and all that, that's BS, blah, blah, blah. Instead of trying to see like, okay, so I didn't like it when people invalidated my story of what's wrong with me. Why don't we take all of these people seriously, that they did get better doing X, Y, and Z, and really try to analyze, well, why is this? What is the larger system that we're working in here, where these different things actually have quite a lot in common that help this subsection of womidom, and these things over here seem to help this subsection of womidom, and to have sort of a more cohesive understanding of how these things work, and also how they could be replicated in a more, you know, traditional medical environment. Because I think a lot of things that you see in alternative medicine, because they have like a woo-woo packaging, but what they're doing is not super different from what an antidepressant is doing, or what, you know, some sort of treatment within regular medicine. The effect it's having in the body is not super dissimilar from this more woo-woo thing. And so what I would like to see is a lot more research looking at, well, what do all of these things actually, how are they working in ways that are similar? And then which is the better approach, and which is the approach that does the least harm, and et cetera, and things like that. So for me, it felt really important to criticize traditional medicine, because that's been just a horror show for me, but not to let alternative medicine escape, because alternative medicine, even though it's a lot more welcoming of people like me, it's less mean. You know, that only gets you so far. That's not enough. And but for me in the beginning, like, that was enough. I was like, I'm so grateful to just be around people who are kind, you know, who are compassionate and who clearly believe me. So, but there are, you know, alternative medicine is rife with problems, and it's not covered by insurance. And so it's very, very expensive. And that's means that so many people are excluded from even trying any of these things.
I'm going to get to questions in a second, but I just want to ask, I know we're doing this with the Museum of Science, but I'm a writer person. And I just want to say, for people who haven't read the book, it's just such a beautiful read. And it's the writing is lyrical in a particular way that I enjoyed. And anyone who likes any kind of memoir will like this. And I wanted to talk to you about the art of the writing, because there are moments that feel like I'm reading the best science reporter ever, and then the next minute I feel like I'm reading gorgeous poetry. And the way in which you tell the story is so unique, where you allow yourself many different voices. I wondered what the process was like for you. What mood went into different kinds of writing, how you knew different styles to bring into this book. You know, even it's musical in some ways, and that should not be a surprise to anyone. But can you talk about sort of your process of just the writing?
Yes, so I love talking about this, especially with other writers, because it was not an easy process. It wasn't like I just opened up my computer and it just poured out of me. That is not what happened.
It reads that way, so well done.
That is not what happened. I wrote 2 full manuscripts that went into the trash before we got to this one. There is nothing except for maybe the ideas from the other 2 manuscripts. And kind of what happened was I began the whole thing at Columbia when I was in the writing program there. And actually the first essay I ever wrote is very similar to the first couple of pages of the whole book. So it's like, it was like trying to come out in a very specific way. And then when I sold the book, I actually wrote the book proposal in the exact same voice that this book is in right now. But then when I went to actually go sit down with the blank page and like write the book, I got a little lost and I started like affecting this sort of like memoir voice, this like wistful, sad, like, oh, these horrible things that have happened to me, because a lot of horrible things have happened to me. And I kind of just like got away from myself and I would read it over and just be like, oh, this, I just hated it. I hated every moment of rereading it. And I think it was so what happened was she had my laptop stolen and and I had not backed up that entire manuscript. But I felt this incredible sense of relief because I was like, good, I have to start over again. Like, this is terrible. This is a terrible manuscript. And then I went back to the drawing board with the book proposal that I'd written. I was like, this worked. And I really looked at, well, what is going on here that worked? And all of the things that you see in the book are happening in the book proposal, like a lot of white space, like between sections, a lot of very short, punchy, like a section that's one line, or like 5 lines in a row that are only like 5 words each. There's a lot of things like that I had been doing just because it was fun to me in the proposal, and I had a lot of fun with the proposal. And I started to be like, oh, this is what people are talking about when they talk about finding your voice. This way of writing is fun for me, and it sounds like me. It sounds much more like something that I would either write as a piece of music, or the way that I would talk to somebody else, like, is just reflected so much better in this style of writing, which was much, much, much faster. It's like a very, very fast paced and just, I don't know, just less stuck in like the wallows of it all. Like, because it really was for a long time. And I was very concerned that, because there's no way that I would ever publish that. And so once I finally hit on this, that kind of unlocked my ability to write about the rest of it in a way that it was at least like fun to do. I didn't know if other people would like it, but I knew that I would like it, and that was important.
It's so vivid and just a beautiful read. But I want to get to questions, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry your laptop got stolen, and I didn't realize you were going to say you felt relieved, because I would never feel. I mean, as a writer, I just shuddered. But a few questions that center on support, which is, how do we support these people in our lives? One person asked specifically, what does providing support look like other than monetary? For example, are you a good listener? And it's a good question, because I think many people are good at one thing and not good at another. And I, if I could throw money at every problem, I would. I don't have money to throw it at, but what are the many ways that people can help someone?
Yeah, so I'll go over some ways, but I always, because people are very particular, actually, like sometimes some of the things that help me, I've like posted about it, and I hear somebody else being like, oh, I would not, that would make me feel bad. And so I do think it's a kind of a difficult, like emotionally vulnerable conversation to have, but to just be frank with somebody that you do want to support and just talk to them and say, how can I support you? Not like, hey babe, is there anything that I can do? No, like I really want to have like a real conversation with you. Like I really do want to show up for you and support you. And like, so some of the things that have occurred to me are whatever, X, Y, and Z. But what feels good to you? Like, what can I actually, what would be good? Is it like sending you a video every morning that cheers you up? Is it bringing you food, once a month that you can freeze in the freezer? Like if you just give me your dietary restrictions, things like that. I think having that conversation is really worthwhile instead of like martyring yourself and helping this person in a way that's not helping them. Like, and then they don't want to tell you that because they know that it's really nice of you to be doing this, but if it's not actually helping them, then it's like a waste of your time. And if you're going to spend all that time and energy, I think it's really worth knowing that the person actually wants that type of help. I will say that the one type of help besides financial help, I think everybody, like, because so many of us end up unable to work and have to, lean on our significant others or our parents or GoFundMe's or things like that. So financial support, I think, is always very welcome because it's very difficult to get disability for diseases that, it's hard to find even a doctor that will, write you like a note, let alone go through the legal process with you. Anyway, the one thing that I think is really, really helpful is witness. I write about this in the book, but is having a conversation where you are asking the other person, like, tell me about what it's like to be you. I want to hear all of it if you're comfortable with that. Because a lot of us, some people post constantly about what's going on in their bodies, and some people write a book about it, but I do not post like online about very often. I just did a week ago, but that was very rare. I don't feel comfortable constantly being like, here's what happened with my ileostomy back today. Like, that's not me. And so what ends up happening, because of course I look absolutely fine, is that you start to feel further and further away from people because you feel like I think they probably don't understand what it's actually like in my real life, like how hard I'm going to crash after this event, because that is going to happen, even though I wouldn't spend my energy any other way, but that is going to happen. And so for me, to just use myself as an example, to have friends that, like, if they watched us, to check in with me and to acknowledge, like, I was there for you. I'm so glad that I was able to show up at the event, but tell me how you're feeling now. Just give it to me. Just give me the full download of like how you're feeling. I want to hear all of it. Don't edit yourself. That is so helpful to people like who have to like bottle all this stuff up all the time, to just feel like there's somebody who not just will, but wants to hear what's going on for you. My experience, and I know this is true for so many people like me, is that allows us to like move past it and be less stuck in like the sadness of it all and the rage of it all. It like really helps to have people. My dad and my mom both do this. My dad will call now. He didn't used to do this at all before. And we went through this whole training process together, like Rocky, like really learning how to be mirroring and how to be empathetic and how to not skate past the difficult stuff, that I really needed him to linger on the difficult stuff because it made me feel like I wasn't invisible and like he cared about what was going on with me. And so now my dad, I pick up and I'm like, hey dad, and he's like, tell me everything. Tell me. And I'm like, I'm okay. He's like, I know that's not true. I know you're in pain. I know that you must feel like shit. You must feel bad. And oh my God, it's like the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I know that that's really true for a lot of people like me. Now, if that's not true for you and you're watching this and you're like, oh, that sounds like my nightmare, well then don't, when you have your conversation with the people you need support from, tell them not to do that. But I know that for most of us, it's really, really helpful. And that it's something that you don't just do once, that you do fairly regularly. And it doesn't have to be a very long conversation. You're just like, yeah, I feel terrible. Thank you for asking.
And I'm sure it goes both ways too, because I'm always thinking, well, I don't want to be the sister who calls every day and is like, tell me all about all of the pain. Like, I also want to know what you're watching on TV. And
Yeah,
I suppose variation is good, but it's a great answer. We have a question about there's a lot of science in this book. What has been the reception like from the medical community? I'm curious if you've heard from doctors after this book was published who took a look and said, yikes, what did we do here? What did we not do here?
Yeah, well, so far, I'm sure this is going to trigger like cancellation or something, but like so far the reception has been very good from the physicians who have read it. I think it's probably a self-selecting group of people who want to read this. I know a lot of brave patients who mailed this book to the doctor that treated them terribly, or many doctors that treated them terribly. I love hearing that. I don't think that those people are the most likely to pick it up, but maybe they will. And I do think that hearing it from somebody else, like hearing it from somebody who seems serious, right? And you don't have all these preconceived notions about, I know many people who have changed their mind just because they read this. This is true for a lot of people's encounter with any book like this, or like the film Unrest about ME/CFS, that where family members were incredibly disbelieving until they watched, a piece of work by somebody who isn't their loved one that they have all of these, ideas about. There's just something about having it be outside of that person that I think can help you change your mind. And so, but in terms of the science, like I haven't had, at this point, like, I read about the microbiome, for example, which in the beginning, when I started writing about it in 2005, everybody treated me like I was just like completely absurd. And what is all of this about gut bugs and blah, 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 blah. Now that's like one of the most mainstream ideas that people talk about all the time. Everybody knows the word most people know the word microbiome and know that, gut health may have something to do with overall health, et cetera. And it's not a fringe idea at all, but it really was in the beginning. And so my experience has actually been that for so much of the writing of the book, because I started so long ago, I felt like I was out on the skinniest limb and I felt very worried that it would break and that I would be wrong. And what has actually happened is like the trunk of the tree has just like moved closer and closer and closer to me. And for the most part, like all of the stuff that I've been talking about, because I don't go into like super fringe territory at all, it's really just basics in this book. It's all becoming mainstream. And so that, which is good. The only thing that is a little bit problematic to me is that as it becomes mainstream, I wish that there was like every time a doctor changed their mind or a hospital or whatever, that like a little like alarm went off and like you had to say, I was wrong. I take full responsibility and I apologize to anybody that I treated like a piece of garbage. I know better now and I'm going to do better. And I'm going to keep in mind that I'm not always right about everything, because I've noticed a lot of people change the way that they act around these things as if they have always had these positions and ideas. And I'm like, buddy, I remember you. You don't get to do that, because if you don't take responsibility for the ways that you've changed, it makes change that much harder, that like you're just so resistant to change because you're worried about being wrong. But I think if you can just accept that you're wrong about some things, right about other things, it makes it easier to adopt new ways of thinking about things.
I'm going to do one more question, which of course is incredibly complicated, and then we will start to wrap things up. Someone asks, what's your hope for integrative medicine, if any? Is there a way that our healthcare system can better adapt to these complex illnesses? I'm sure this person doesn't expect you to change all public policy with one answer, but I'm sure you're asked this question frequently, which is, what are we supposed to do after we read this book? And especially if you're someone who works in medicine.
Well, the number one thing that would help with the sort of the issues that we see in alternative medicine would be for insurance to cover integrative medicine. It doesn't have to cover, your ayahuasca trip to Peru, but to cover, basic integrative medicine that is evidence-based and science-based. I think that would go a long way to kind of bridging the gap between sort of like the wealthy people who can afford to do this and everybody else, and would kind of destigmatize it as being this like thing for Gwyneth Paltrow and her friends. And when it's really not, and you see regular medicine adopting piece by piece all these things in regular medicine, self-care, sleep hygiene, an anti-inflammatory diet. I mean, bit by bit every year, it sort of migrates into regular medicine. But I think it would be very helpful, especially for people with really complex issues, to be able to be seen by the type of physician who is actually trained to take care of this type of patient. It would be, in many ways, it would be a way of having like a specialty for WOMIs, that like your doctor can refer you without it being costing you, $5,000 out of pocket or whatever, to refer you to go see somebody that actually knows what they're doing, as kind of like a stopgap between, because the most important thing that has to happen is the funding of the research into all of these illnesses. That is I should have said this at the beginning. When we talk about mystery illnesses, it's not that they are so complex that they just exceed the abilities of the human mind to wrap your mind around. That is not it. It's that we have not funded the study of these illnesses relative to the way that we fund the study of other comparable illnesses. I mean, it's like 1%, it's less than 1% of what we put aside for, the other big bads, like ME/CFS, especially at the progressed end of the spectrum. That is a big bad. And so it should not be funded with $14 million a year, which is half the amount that we put aside to study eczema. Like, listen, eczema, I have eczema, like, it's no fun, right? But eczema is so it shouldn't be in the same stratosphere as something like ME/CFS in the way that we fund ME/CFS. So this is just to say that's actually the most important thing in terms of creating better care models for these patients. I think looking to integrative medicine, because they've actually been taking care of patients like us for a long time. They have the experience. They're the ones that have been looking at the data that does exist. They have the clinical experience. That is very important in directing the type of research that we do. That instead of just like starting from scratch and being like, okay, we're going to fund it now, but we're not going to listen to any of the people who have any experience in this area because they're integrative doctors and we don't like that in traditional medicine. That would be a major mistake. But I think just increasing the funding and putting pressure on your representatives to fund these illnesses. There's a bill that Jamie Raskin in Maryland has introduced to increase the funding for ME/CFS. I think it's like from 14 million to 146 million. That's still not enough, but that's a lot more. That's like starting to get into the ballpark of where the research would actually yield something instead of research that's not going to yield anything. The amount of money set aside right now is not enough to study almost anything. So those are sort of the two things I would say. I think it would help a lot to cover integrative medicine with insurance. And then, of course, to fund the study of all of these illnesses, to really apply the tools that we have at all of our research institutions to try and figure out what is going on, what treatments work, which ones don't, et cetera.
I just want to congratulate you on the book and on the paperback release. And I want to just tell everybody, because, Sarah and I talked about this earlier, that, yes, this is, if you're hearing about this and saying, oh, I want to buy this for someone in my life who is this kind of person and has dealt with these problems, that's fair to do, but I would also say buy it for yourself. And I would say buy it for your own friends and buy it for their friends and their family. And then for the doctors that they saw. And if you have a book club, this is such a good book club book. I just think there's so much to talk about. This is a memoir that is about an experience that is not universal and yet is. And there are so many conversations to be had about who knows someone like this or why we don't know that we do, and just what the experience is of navigating an institution that's set up in a particular way, a system that's set up in a particular way. So I mean, I could go on about why I love this book all night. So I will. But I just want to thank you for writing it and just to congratulate you, because it's just the most beautifully written thing I've read in a very long time, and I'm sure so many people felt seen, and I know my family did. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That's so nice.
Thank you all for coming and asking wonderful questions and engaging in this, and to the Museum of Science for bringing us content. And we don't even have to leave our homes, which is accessible and wonderful. So I welcome you back to join us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both, Sarah Ramey and Meredith Goldstein, for that really just inspiring and informative conversation. I know I learned so much. I know our audience has, and I know so many people tonight have probably been helped, as they have been by this incredible book, and as they will in its new paperback form as well. So just thank you both for taking time to be here tonight, for sharing space and allowing us to share this with our audiences. It's truly been a pleasure. And if you have not picked up your own copy yet, you still can by going to any of your local bookstores, look on IndieBound, and of course, really anywhere that books are sold. You will not regret it. As Meredith said, pick it up for yourself, your friends, friends of friends, and all medical professionals in your life. So thank you both. Sarah, I hope we can invite you here to the museum when it's safe to do so one day, celebrating your next book. And Meredith, it continues to always be a joy to be able to have you a part of our programming. So thank you both. I want to thank everyone from the Lowell Institute for their ongoing support of the adult programming here at the museum. Without them, we could not have done this over the past year virtually. So thank you, thank you. And thank you to our audience for spending your Wednesday night with us. We hope you'll join us tomorrow, and of course in the fall as well. Until then, everyone stay safe, stay well. Have a wonderful night. Oh, a cameo. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.